Thank you for that kind introduction. So I'm really honoured to be here today, and I'm going to talk about what's on the slide. So, a holistic, digital-first systems approach. I want to start by acknowledging that I work on the land of the Gadigal. So they are the people of the grass tree. And I want to extend my respect to First Nations people, both in the land that I work on and also here in New Zealand. And that's the reason that the picture's here of the grass tree, which is the Gadi of the Gadigal. Not sure where I point my clicker. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about systems approach and digital, and to acknowledge that many of just to sort of start us off, to sort of think about how many of the buildings that we build are complex. They're complex systems of systems, and I wanted to start with the example of the Sydney Opera House because it's one of the things that Sydney is known for. And we've been celebrating 50 years of the Opera House in Sydney, and it's an iconic building for Sydney. Now, if you look at the construction of that Opera House, the construction is, in a sense, the Australian story of the Opera House. So Danish architect, Danish engineer, but it wouldn't have been possible to build without the contractor, Holbrook, who built it. And a fantastic off-site production of the ribs and then putting it together on site. So it's done on the laydown area, put together on site. Very innovative building. But how would we build that today? So when you look at that 50 years ago, we have people doing practices that we would not see as safe today, hanging around. You can see the little people kind of up on those ribs, putting the pieces together. And I've got colleagues. So this is a very complexly organized. It's complex technically. It's complex organizationally. So it involves architects, engineers, builders, contractors, subcontractors, manufacturers. Many of our buildings are complex in this way. And I've got colleagues in the architecture department at the University of Sydney who've been using this building as an example with their students and really thinking about, if you were going to put a building this complex together today, how would you do it? So they've got work going on using digital technologies, using virtual reality, using 3D printing, using robotics, and really starting to think about how can we build in this digital-first world to make our construction sites safer, to interact across organisational boundaries, to deliver the kinds of innovative buildings that we want to deliver, but to do that in ways that are safe for all of us. So this is work by Paolo Strachey and his colleagues looking at this building, and I was delighted that they invited me to be part of the work that they'd done celebrating the 50 years of this opera house. I want to use an example that I'm closer to, which is the work that was done post the Grenfell disaster in the UK. So I'm not going to talk particularly about the disaster or the inquiry that came out of that disaster, although I lived within 2 kilometres of this building when it went on fire. So this is a residential building that was being refurbished at the time in which there was a significant fire. It was a beautiful summer's day, beautiful blue sky day, which we don't get a lot of in London, and it was a very traumatic event for the whole of the city, and this is why I show you the building that's still standing there. They're thinking about demolishing it, but it's been a very difficult journey for, of course, the people involved, but also for the city around that. But what I was involved in was the process that they went through with the industry to say, how did this industry refurbish a building in such a way that it went on fire. So I was involved in the independent review of building regulations and fire safety. And that was led by a lady called Judith Hackett, who's a process systems engineer. And what she did was she mapped the processes that our industry goes through when it's building things, and really discovered there are just these gaps where the client thinks that they're getting an architect that's going to oversee the whole process. What they're actually contractually getting is an architect that's going to go in and do a little bit of design work. And you know, there are gaps in how information is flowing between professions. And sitting on her panel, it was frankly quite shocking. You know, having been in this industry for 30 years when I'm sitting on this panel, I was also surprised at the gaps that were existing in this process in terms of flows of information. And so what she was arguing for was this need for a golden thread of information that went through that process so that information was not missing between different stages of that process as people came in and out of that process and they did their bits of work, that information created that continuity of understanding through the process. And so these are sort of my opening arguments for why we need a systems approach when we're thinking about digital information. So I'm going to talk about the growth in computing power, some of the policy work that I've been involved in that involves digital, a little bit about our research, and then I will conclude by coming back to this idea of a systems approach. So I did some work mapping out, so I've done quite a lot of work on digital, and I'm just going to give you a taster of a few pieces of that in this talk today, so it's not possible to cover everything. But I did some work with a colleague in the US, Ray Levitt, on how information management and the management of projects are interconnected. And we started with one of the big US defense projects, post-war defense projects, in which IBM was a small startup. And we looked at really the way in which the software industry and projects have grown up together. The techniques for managing projects have been intertwined with software since the very beginning. And so we started to look at the way that hardware, software, and new capabilities created new opportunities for us to think differently about the way that we manage projects. And the original version of this came out in 2011 when I was holding a phone that looked something like this. We've updated it more recently, thinking a little bit about where you know, extending that framework sort of through to 2010s and 2020s. And I took the photo of me holding a phone last night in a hotel, or the night before in a hotel, to add to this. But what I really want to say with this is that, you know, our devices are becoming cheaper, more distributed, more multifunctional. There's increasing data availability and use, potential for wide-ranging implications for design, delivery, operation, and maintenance. Increasing integration of those pieces is my argument, that actually pieces of the process that used to be separate can become more integrated through digital information, and we need that. That persistence of information can carry knowledge across different parts of that process. Whether we want to talk about a digital thread, a digital model, a digital twin, a digital platform, digital analytics, I think all these terms are used just to think about that systems approach. And also, I think today the amount of information that we can generate through technologies like AI are beginning to really challenge us. Yeah, and this image is generated, right? So this hand is a digitally generated hand holding a digitally generated phone. But I think increasingly we're going to have that mix of information that's been digitally generated and information that's generated by humans. And that's something we're going to be challenged by. Yeah, it's also an opportunity. And we're going to have to work our way through how we engage these technologies to build better buildings in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about the policy work that I've been involved in, and I do think that government and policy organisations have a really important role to play in our sector because we're often working on projects. And so that kind of policy that goes across projects is really helpful for us knowing what we're going to find when we go into a project. And I've been involved in some of that policy work, most recently working with the New South Wales government, starting to think about their roadmap and the digitisation work that they're doing. But what I'm going to talk about is the work that I did pre-COVID when I was in the UK and involved in this work on the implementing the industry strategy in the UK. So part of Construction Leadership Council, thinking about things like the construction playbook, but in particular the transforming construction agenda. And what I want you to notice is that digital is part of this agenda. So along with the idea of construction, manufacturing and energy sits the idea of digital. And so it's not being thought of outside of thinking about a bigger transformation to the sector in this work. So with the idea that collaborating around shared data can improve our collaboration, our productivity, it can enable this integration, and it can improve performance. In the UK, I think one thing that they really importantly did was put in this presumption in favour of off-site, and that really drove a lot of this thinking about how can we use digital, how can we build more sustainably. So it was very much driven by this idea of using modern methods of construction. And so we've got factory buildings in companies like Lang O'Rourke that sponsored my chair in the UK. We've got companies like HTA Architects doing residential building in an off-site way. And I was working with also with I was teaching in the UK, but I was also teaching for related places like Singapore, where they were doing work in off-site in Singapore, and they were bringing people over to London to see what London was doing in this space. Bryden Wood did a lot of the work on digital for the UK, so it worked on delivery platforms for government assets, data-driven infrastructure platforms, and it developed a lot of software for the sector that's open source. Their competitive approach was to build the services around the software, but to make the software open for others to use. So it was building approaches to thinking about digital in our sector. And particularly around things like product platforms. Now, what was interesting for me, moving from being on Judith Hackett's committee around the digital thread and then being involved in this work on transforming construction, was that these agendas had been developed separately and then needed to be kind of brought together. So, Judith Hackett's work around safety and how do we build for the safety of our construction workers, but also for the residents of our buildings? How do we think about ourselves as a safety critical industry? And this work around how do we innovate the way that we're building these buildings, developed very separately and needed to be brought together. And the challenge there is that, of course, when you have an off-site strategy, you need to think about that earlier in the process. So you need to really have that kind of upfront understanding of what you're going to do so that it comes together on site. The product platform takes your innovation away from being on one site and takes it to being across a number of sites. So you start to think about components and having a library of components and how you bring those components together. And so start to think about construction as more of a manufacturing, repeatable industry where you can start to optimize across components. And so this was the journey that the UK was on, thinking about product platforms. And digital is really essential to this. So I think digital is very embedded in that idea about how do we build off-site in more productive ways. So my team has been doing research in and around these buildings. I'm going to give you an example of work that we did on a big metro project. First of all, just many years ago, so more years ago than I want to remember, sort of about 25, let's say 25 years ago, a little bit more than that. I did my PhD on the use of virtual reality in this industry. And I wrote a book on it after I finished my PhD. I updated it more recently in 2018, which was basically writing a different book because the technologies have really changed and transformed, and the opportunity to use these technologies has really grown. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I came out of this interest in how do we visualize this information in ways that different people can interact with it. And people are not, the general population is not that good at reading plans and sections. And so I think these technologies really enable people to engage with what's being built for them, as well as allowing different parts of the sector to work with each other. And so, we've done a little bit of work on this virtual reality piece. Gone too forward. If I can go back one. Yeah. So we did quite a bit of work pre-COVID around what's now called the Elizabeth line. So it's a big metro project, and I know people from that metro project came out to Sydney and have been involved in producing a similar project in Sydney Metro. Sydney Metro has just opened very successfully. The Elizabeth line is similar to that. And I know that Auckland has also been building train railways. But I was involved in the digital side of this. So I had a PhD student in the information management team in this project, and I was also on their BIM advisory committee. So we had a project within the innovation program bringing in a pop-up cave. So we built a visualization facility that you could pop up. It was kind of basically like a little marquee that you could pop up and that they could bring their models into and view their models. And it was used both technically, the engineers used it, and we developed a workflow for them to bring their models in. This is the kind of engineering model, right? So it's not beautifully polished for visitors, but it's useful for the engineers to understand what they're seeing and how they're using it. And so this is the kind of work that we were doing with Crossrail. It was funded through their innovation program, and their innovation program was match funded by the client and the first tier contractors. And so what you found was that the contractors wanted to get their money back, right? So they wanted to use your innovation because they had skin in the game. They were part funding the project, and so it was exciting to work with them on this technology. So looking at how they could visualize their designs and they could work with others across the project. We also did some work again on interfaces and systems in Crossrail. So we brought Crossrail together with Airbus and with CERN, because all of those companies in Europe had this challenge of increasing amounts of data. As we start to use digital information on these very large projects, you get a huge number of files, frankly. And so how did they manage change in these large data sets? And that was a challenge that all three of those leading organizations saw and wanted to explore together. And so keeping your requirements and your digital assets and the physical assets lined up was the challenge that they saw. And my PhD student was really in Crossrail looking at what's called the redlining process, right, where something happens on site, they draw a red line on the document, and then they go back and they kind of change everything, which is, of course, not the ideal way of doing this, but it's the reality of what happens on a lot of our construction sites today. So we were thinking through, how do we manage that change process, and how do we understand it, and how do we use the digital information to understand interfaces on these large projects. I'm currently leading the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership at the University of Sydney. And one of the things that attracted me to move to Sydney is that this institute looks across sectors. So it doesn't just look at our sector of construction and infrastructure, but it also looks at other complex project industries. And so we've been continuing to look at digital. So we look at project leadership in a changing world, and we look at digital information, organizational dynamics, projects for sustainable, resilient, and just futures. But I have a team of colleagues that are looking at digital transformation, new AI methods for project delivery and governance, digital transformation by projects, and how digital information transforms the project model. And they've been doing work with bits of the government in New South Wales around things like assessing delivery confidence of digital projects, sponsorship and digital, and then we've been doing work through a major project leadership forum around collaboration and productivity and outcomes. So we're beginning to do that kind of policy work in Australia. I'm just putting together a teaching program around digital project delivery. So beginning to teach the next generation of project managers as to how they engage with the digital information on projects. There's a lot that I can talk about research, but I've tried to keep it quite short and give you a flavour of the kind of work that we're doing. Increasingly, my team are deeply engaged in AI. So looking at different forms of natural language processing and machine learning to understand how we can start to use these technologies in our sector. But I just want to conclude with this, coming back to this idea of a holistic digital-first systems approach. Now, when the ICE, the Institution of Civil Engineers, has written a number of reports around systems approaches to infrastructure, and when they talked about digital, they talk about data oiling your project. And, you know, I absolutely see that. It's interesting, in some of those conversations, people said, oil is the wrong analogy, right? And I think we need to sort of recognize that we're in a world where there are increasing pressures on our projects, and so we need to think about how we can use digital information to address these increasing pressures, whether they're about the sustainability and climate, whether they're about the challenges of delivery in this contemporary world. Digital is a very powerful tool for engaging with some of these pressures. In the UK, we had a BIM task group that led into the Transforming Construction agenda that I was talking about, where they put some money on how much is spent by the government in plan, design and build versus maintain and operate versus all of the activities that go on in the buildings that our industry delivers. So they began to think about, okay, so how do we think about information flows across that life cycle, not just in the project, but then into maintenance and operation. And having done some work on that handover, I know it doesn't always happen, right? So that handover into operations is quite a challenge for governments. So I wanted just to return us to thinking about, kind of 50 years ago, we were building buildings without digital information. Today, digital information is everywhere in our organizations, right? So the question is not really, do we use digital information? It's really about how do we use it productively, and how do we create these digital threads or these flows of information that allow us to build better, to build safer, to build more productively. And that's really where I'm going to end. So I know I'm. Oh, if I could just say one thing on that slide. So I think digital information. I would like to end with this idea of digital information for making choices and managing risk in building futures. So that's sort of really where I wanted to end us. Thank you.